Now, Nori is the manager of the Hargrave-Andrew Library at Monash. That's the Medical Science and Engineering Library at that research-intensive Monash University Library in Melbourne, Australia. And Nori's going to talk to us about the library as an intelligence organisation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Nori.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And I'm presenting from Melbourne, Australia. So my short talk today is about a growing field of what is generally known as research metrics and intelligence. And I'd like to share some observations as well as reflections on the experience my colleagues and I have been having as part of our practice in my institution, which is Monash University Library in Australia. Now, I'll say outright that this talk is not so much about a report on a discrete project or initiative or anything short term. Rather, it's more of an attempt in order to consolidate some of the reflections we have had over the last 5 years or so in response to the changing landscape in the field of research metrics and intelligence. Of course, the idea of research metrics is not something for which we have a universally agreed consensus or anything like that. And depending on who you ask, that term may well mean different things, from the traditional bibliometrics to some of the so-called intelligence databases or other metrics tools that have become prevalent in recent years. The focus of this talk is indeed the latter, that is the intelligence databases and metrics tools, in which usually the publishers use sophisticated interface in order to offer the analytics and the visualization of the publication and citation data. You can think of the products such as Scival, Insight, Dimensions, Cortalis, Altmetrics, and so on, just as an example to name a few. Having this said, I will not discuss any specific products or tools in this talk, and since my focus is not so much about those individual products and tools, but how this, as a technological trend, influence the nature of the professional and organizational role the library has played in the university setting. But for now, just to start with, I must first say a few words about my own institution, just to give you a bit of a context, as well as just explaining where I am coming from. So the university I work for is called Monash University, based in Melbourne, and it has 4 campuses and 2 additional locations scattered around Melbourne. And the university also has its international presence in 5 international locations, with a total of 10 faculties spanning from HAS discipline to STEM disciplines. It's one of the largest universities in Australia, with approximately 86,000 students with 18,000 staff members. Although it is a relatively young institution, only established in the 50s, it has grown into one of the most research-intensive universities in Australia. It's a member of the National Alliance of the 8 research-focused universities in Australia, called the Group of 8, which collectively wins almost 3/4 of the entire Australian government's competitive grants, for example. The university has also been ranked in the top 100 in a number of international university rankings for some years, including being the 55th in the QS World University ranking this year. So it's a reasonably large university with some very strong focus on research activities. Now, Monash University has its central library services provider, that is Monash University Library, where I work. And we have its university librarian reporting directly to the university's provost. Now, within the structure of the library, there are 6 branch libraries and 2 locations in Melbourne, while working also with a number of affiliated hospital libraries, as well as library services in international campuses. My role in the library is the manager of the 2 STEM and medicine-focused branches, one being the Medicine, Engineering, Computing and Science Library called Hargrave-Andrew, and another being the Pharmacy Library called the C.L. Butcher's Library. There, I work with my colleagues, including teams of academic liaison librarians who engage with researchers in different faculties at different levels. These academic liaison staff, including myself, conduct a wide range of research supporting activities, including consultation with individual academics, delivering research training programs and workshops for researchers and graduate students, and also representing the library in the faculty's research committees or similar portals. The portfolio of these academic liaison librarians are quite diverse, and the research intelligence and metrics is only one of the many fields of research support activities these colleagues actually cover. But the last few years saw an increasing number, as well as increasing complexity of the queries in this area, which prompted me to reflect upon how this is actually impacting our activities and also our roles, as well as the level and nature of the advice we offer to our clients who are academics and researchers. I must say that outside of the library, the researchers' reactions to the topic of research metrics vary vastly depending on who you actually ask. I know some researchers, friends of mine, who just do not care about the metrics at all. They are quite happy, carrying on with the research they have been conducting for years. On the other hand, I also hear from researchers, who arrived in Australia more recently, and they are puzzled to have realized how much their Australian colleagues care about the metrics, implying that this is almost like one of the peculiar Australian obsessions. Though some variations, there is nevertheless some sense of pragmatic resolution held by many in the research communities around us. That is, the metrics won't necessarily go away anytime soon, and they are indeed growing their presence steadily over years in the research communities. For example, the metrics based on commercially available data, such as that of Web of Science and Scopus, are often used to identify what is considered as a quality publication outlets for reporting purposes in the faculties as well as at the university level. And they are often used out of necessity to draw a line in the sand, so to speak, even though many people acknowledge their inherent limitations. Universities and individual researchers are also often celebrated for their success and achievements in the form of the metrics. And the regulators and the funding bodies also recognize these metrics as one of the relatively reliable, tangible, and verifiable indicators of the research impact as well. Now, the point I wanted to make, I know actually this sounds rather obvious, but at the same time, the point I wanted to make is the metrics has become very much part of the broad machination of research policies, practices, and administrations. And here the metrics is no longer simply a piece of neutral information, but a piece of intelligence that is the instructive information encoded with a very specific meanings and narrative in order to cater for the specific purposes. And it is in this landscape that the intelligence databases and the metrics tools have emerged as a powerful information processing tools with an inherently skewed, yet impressively sizable pool of publication and citation data. And they process and visualize them in such a way that effectively reinforces certain narratives about the research performance and the values of research. And for many, especially for those researchers who do not yet have an established profile in the discipline, the idea of research metrics adds another layer of complexity to the way they build and develop their research identity, alongside many other things such as their social media presence, researcher profiles, in addition to, of course, the actual publications themselves. And in this context, the research intelligence and metrics appear to be, at least for some, mysterious black boxes, and they understandably would like to know how they work, how their research gets translated, and also furthermore, how they can actually use them to their advantage. That is the kind of, or the nature of discussion in which we as library staff often get involved. And just like a 17th century curiosity cabinet, we do receive all sorts of weird and wonderful queries as we carry on our day-to-day businesses. And the variety often conceals the subtle changes emerging in the nature of the client's queries over time. So in order to make sense of what kind of queries we tend to receive. I might offer quasi-typology for this, even though it is not as neat as an evolutionary tree. But anyway, so the first category of question, let's say, which had to do with some factual questions, such as what is an H-index? You might also throw in some of the how-to questions, such as how can I get a SNP, and so on. Many libraries offer resources for these questions, and our library is, of course, no exception. Then we have another category whose questions are to do with what the metrics actually means. I had someone asking me if they are in trouble only because of the metrics, which they thought were not as good as they expected. Another example would be I saw some graduate students asking me what to make of the metrics associated with a journal to which they just submitted their papers, for example. And you can imagine our response would have to be rather nuanced, and they have to be delivered in a well-contextualized manner. Then we have another category, shall we say, which had to do with what they can do with their metrics. For example, some perceptive students asked us in one of the workshops we ran what they should be doing in order to make sure that they have very good metrics in 5 years. They're actually thinking about the future, and we need to actually cater for such requests and queries. Another example of this line of arguments or the question is that an editor of the journal asked us once how they can increase the profile of their journal, which they thought was compromised because of the discipline-based classifications imposed by the publishers. Now, with these queries, things are getting quite complex, and you will need to understand not just about the metrics and products themselves, but also the culture and practices of the respective research communities, as well as the ways scholarly communications actually work, of which many librarians have very good knowledge of. I have added another category just for the sake of discussion, which is about more creative or strategic use of research intelligence for their own creative purposes. This is something like, if we could use these databases in order to identify potentially promising research areas, just like some of the IP databases visualize the niche fields in the market. I must admit that I have only discussed such prospects hypothetically with my faculty colleagues, but there are some institutions, especially in the States, who have dedicated teams offering such services. So what does this all mean? Now, one can tease out many observations out of this variety, but I might discuss 2 key issues which I found that have significant implications to the role the library plays in this field. So the first issue is to do with the extent of our advice and how these intelligence databases and metrics tools challenge the traditional paradigm of collection management, which we are so used to. While they are often called databases, they are actually better described as subscription-based online tools with a paid exclusive data. Unlike the electronic resources subscriptions, these intelligence databases require not only the provision of access, but also some levels of ongoing support as to how such tools can be used in a contextualized manner. And this is not to say, not at the level of technical instructions, but at the level of meaningful and responsible use of those tools for each of the client's specific purposes. However commonsensical this may sound, if we think about any electronic subscriptions of the journal, for example, you can see how novel this question actually is. So if we are to offer an e-version of a given text, then we tend to recognize our responsibility to make it accessible to the clients, but we probably do not necessarily feel too responsible for, say, how the clients will use the text as part of their research. It would be ridiculous to think that we feel obliged or the need to offer guidance on how to interpret Shakespeare's Tempest only because we offer its e-version, for example. The intelligence databases and metrics tools are a little bit different, we found. The fact that we manage these tools and also that we have some background industry knowledge of the scholarly publication puts us in a very unique position to be able to offer certain types of advice, such as how these tools interact with and complement other similar products, and also what kind of data sources these tools use behind their sophisticated interface and functionalities. In some areas, we have some local knowledge of how different disciplines and research communities approach and utilize these databases and tools for the purposes specific to their institutional and disciplinary requirements. And all these sort of advices are really beyond the products itself. It's something to do with a more of a communal environment. And this leads to my second issue, which I wanted to raise, which is about the nature of our advice and how these intelligence databases and the metrics tools challenge the library's assumed neutrality over the information it offers. In order to highlight this issue, I often refer to Haeckel's information hierarchy, which offers a very useful demarcation between information and intelligence, the latter being a result of inference made on the information that was selectively gathered earlier. The model usefully illustrates a number of points of human intervention as the information gets processed to form a usable knowledge with a human artifice. And the issues I just highlighted earlier then very much aligns with this question of which level of human intervention the library should be engaged when we deal with a subject of research intelligence and metrics. The conventional practice may suggest that our role is to offer the information in the shape they were delivered. Our role is to select which information to offer to our clients, and we will maintain a relative neutrality over the information once the selection is done. However, increasingly, our clients expect us to be involved more actively in the construction and construction of knowledge as well as the narratives that can be inferred from the information we offer. Whether we like it or not, the situation at times demands us to partake in this activity of knowledge and narrative construction for the unique set of knowledge we gain in our practice. And it is in such an environment that we found the library's professional and organizational role being transformed, shifting from being the creators and providers of information and access to that of the analysts of intelligence, being involved even partially in the production of knowledge and narratives that suits the specific purposes and interest of our clients and institutions. Now, I'm sort of trying to illustrate, however, in a hurried manner, the kind of transformative effects of the prevalence of research intelligence and metrics as a technological trend, and how it permeates into the day-to-day practices of library staff, both professionally and organizationally. And on that note, I sort of start concluding my talk by raising a couple of challenges we face in this shift in the library's role. Now, first of all, there is a challenge of how we recognize and develop the research intelligence expertise within the library. While the library's expertise of managing subscriptions and technologies appears overt, the less obvious is the implications of such a technological trend to the nature of the professional services and advice the library collectively offers. In light of the increasing prevalence of research intelligence and metrics, it is very timely and important for us to explicitly articulate what actually entails the library's expertise in this field, which would also inform us what kind of professional development we may need to offer to our own staff. Related to this point is the second point I wanted to make, which is about the institutional recognition of the library's expertise in this field. As much as there exist demands for the expertise in the field of research intelligence and metrics, how such an expertise can be offered by the library really depends on external factors such as funding, resourcing, organizational structure, and technical infrastructure. The recent developments in the field of research intelligence really poses a question of the library's professional identity. That is, in what kind of professional and organizational capacity one could offer advisory services to our clients. And this in turn is also a question of an institutional role of the library as it positions itself within its specific organizational and institutional environment. So I hope, what I shared, rings or prompts some kind of questions or some ideas, and I'd be very interested to actually hear what kind of questions actually you might have as part of this discussion. So on that note, actually, I might just hand back over to you, Tracy. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nori. I think that's a fascinating presentation that raises some really important issues for us as a profession. So please, if people have questions or reflections for Nori, please do post them in the Q&A and we'll pick those up at the end of this session. We're going to move on now to our second speaker, who actually can't be here physically with us today, Sarah Ames, who is the Digital Scholarship Librarian from the National Library of Scotland. We have a pre-recorded presentation from Sarah, and Stuart Lewis, who's the Associate Director of Digital at National Library of Scotland, will be here to answer any questions that are raised as part of this. So Sarah's presentation is entitled Developing a Digital Scholarship Service at the National Library of Scotland, the first year. And I'm going to hand over to Mel now to start the presentation.
Hello, I'm Sarah Ames. I'm the Digital Scholarship Librarian at the National Library of Scotland. Thank you very much for attending this talk today, and thank you to RLUK for accommodating a pre-recorded talk. This was originally due to be a paper presented at the 2020 conference exploring the first year of our digital scholarship service. But then, of course, the world changed, and so is my presentation. So now it's hopefully 2 for the price of 1, and I'll be talking about the first 2 years, and hopefully again all in the space of 20 minutes. Firstly, I wanted to give some brief context for this activity. So if you work in digital or in data at the moment, then I think Scotland is a really exciting place to be. So some examples of recent activity include the Scottish Government's Open Data Strategy, which stipulated that the government organisations should make their data available openly and in reusable formats. And this, I think, really demonstrates the value and importance that's being given to open data from the very top in Scotland. Meanwhile, in 2018, the City Region deal brought a lot of funding to Edinburgh and the regions, particularly around data-driven innovation as well as skills training. And in the academic world, we're lucky to have brilliant universities on our doorsteps. So we've got Edinburgh, for example, which has the world-leading Bayes Institute, which is a centre for data science. There's the Edinburgh Futures Institute being built, which will be the humanities answer to global data challenges. Creative Informatics is an AHRC-funded project exploring the relationship between creative communities and data. And the Centre for Data, Culture and Society has a strong focus on cultural heritage. And you can probably see Professor Melissa Terrace's stamp on a lot of this activity. Glasgow also has the longest standing digital humanities programme in Scotland, with a really strong information studies and digital humanities offering, and the universities of St Andrews, Aberdeen, Stirling and Dundee all have big data and data science related courses. Out with academia, in the meantime, Codebase is a co-working startup space in Edinburgh and Glasgow for data-related businesses, and CodeClan is Scotland's national coding academy, but also in Edinburgh and Glasgow, which takes people from zero to software engineer or data scientist in a matter of weeks. So there's a lot happening in this area at the moment, and it's a really exciting place to be working. Within this context, the National Library of Scotland has been working to a 1/3 digital strategy by 2025, seeking to make 1/3 of its collections available in digital format by its centenary year. So as part of this, the library has invested heavily in mass digitisation, and you can see from the numbers on the screen that this has increased a lot over the last few years. The collection has also reached 31 million items, so there's a lot for digital scholarship, for digital humanities communities here to play with. And digital scholarship now features in the library's new strategy as well, which has just been released. In 2019, the library decided to invest in a digital scholarship service and role, and I've been really lucky that I've been given a huge amount of freedom to develop this service. My role was originally recruited on a 2-year contract. So of course the first thing to do was to set out a 3-year plan. And briefly, this informal document includes defining what was in and out of scope for the service and the library, prioritising which area of digital scholarship to focus on, setting broad measurable objectives around dataset release and setting a schedule for activities, and then finally, and perhaps most frequently forgotten in this area, actually doing what the document set out to do as well. Within all of this, opportunism has also been really important. So you can have a plan for an area like this, but all of this work has to be flexible to enable you to seize the opportunities that come your way. So first, what is digital scholarship? Now, I wouldn't really recommend defining digital scholarship. It's really quite a thankless task, but we had to set the area out clearly for colleagues, and so we've gone with the use of computational methods with National Library of Scotland collections to enable new forms of research. And if you like a Venn diagram, then this is what it looks like. So digital scholarship sits betwixt and between our collections, computational methods, and research activity. So what makes it unique to us really is our collections. It isn't just digital scholarship, it's National Library of Scotland digital scholarship. Our service has got 5 main objectives. So the first one is to enable and support the use of computational research methods with the collections. So a lot of the work in this area is around making collections available in machine readable format or as data. And by doing this, we can start to fulfill our second objective, which is to make sure that the collections are being used to their full potential. So we want to enable all forms of research with our collections, both analogue and digital. The third objective is to establish a culture in the library that understands and can support digital scholarship, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. And then the fourth one is around transparency, and I think this one for me is really important, practicing and promoting transparency in our data creation processes. So how do we ensure that the library retains its position as a trusted source of information when it's increasingly releasing and producing its own collections, its own data collections? And then lastly, and perhaps slightly ambitiously, we want to anticipate the future of research. And what I mean by this is that we want to make sure that our collections stand the test of time, that they remain relevant and usable and useful even when technologies change or when methodologies change. We have 3 levels of service: self-service, where users can download and make use of our data. Then a second level, which includes a short consultation time with a curator, me, or a developer. And then a third level, which is really the funded service, where we can go in as partner or collaborator on projects. So why service? We all know that digital scholarship and digital humanities isn't positioned very often as this in libraries. The narrative in LIBA has been very much around libraries collaborating on projects for digital humanities. The narrative in RLUK is also the same, from project to partner to pioneer. Well, we've called this a service for a number of reasons. Firstly, pragmatic. I really don't want the term project or programme associated with this work because it's too finite, too easy to stop. The service is a term that libraries understand as ongoing activity. It enables systematic service development and service levels agreements between internal services in libraries also. However, we do also need some level of service provision to enable collaboration in the first place. So we need to offer collections as data. We need to provide technical and other support, for example. And then finally, we have to remember that some users don't want to collaborate. They just want to make use of our openly licensed data, which they're perfectly within their right to do so, and which we actively encourage them to do. And then they want to go away and they want to work on their own project. So there's a few reasons there, but we do seek collaborative projects as part of a funded service, which enables us to go in at partner level. There are 3 main areas of work for our digital scholarship service. Firstly, making data available, and as I'm sure you can imagine at a national library, there's loads of areas to play with here. So far, the bulk of our activity and our work has been around text and images because of our mass digitisation programme, but we're also looking at other forms of data too, so people could start to explore the biases in our metadata when we release this. What does a film look like as data? What does a map look like as data? And what would this mean for research questions or discovery if we were able to release them in this way? We release organisational data, some financial data, and also there's challenges around web archive data. So there's a lot here to start to grapple with. Secondly, we work on external engagement, so we collaborate with users. We have a PhD studentship at the moment. We have an annual fellowship that we've started. We've had an artist in residence, but it also means thinking beyond the research community. So as a national library, we've got a broader responsibility than just this, and so it means thinking to other audiences such as creative groups and schools and businesses, and how in the future we might be able to systematically roll out a digital scholarship service to these kind of audiences. And then there's also internal engagement around raising awareness of digital scholarship, setting up skills training opportunities, seeking out champions, and really all of this is feeding into a broader culture change in the library where we're beginning to think about our collections, about our roles, and about our skills in new ways. So our first key piece of work was around creating our open data platform. We had a vision of an open data platform Scotland style, so straight talking, appealingly designed, clear rights information, easy download, straightforward, no nonsense data. First, we needed to identify our users' needs, so we split these into 3 slightly crude groups ranging from beginner to advanced. So on the one hand, we had users who didn't have any technical skills but wanted to use online tools to use with text files, for example. And at the other end of the spectrum, there were advanced developers who could get hold of data no matter what, but who did have expectations of standards. And then in the middle, there was this slightly more complex middle ground user who understood the value of different formats rather than the practice of carrying out data exploration. And this user was more likely to employ a research assistant to carry out the crunching work for them, for example. They wanted easy access to material to check what was in it. We decided to cater to this middle ground because it also enabled us to fulfill many of the needs of both our advanced and our beginner audience. Next, we needed to reconsider how and why we were digitising. So digital scholarship brings about a new use case to digitisation. Previously, we've been digitising solely with the idea of online image galleries in mind, which isn't wrong at all, but we now needed to add in a few extra steps. So on the screen here is a really broad overview of how you go from a print collection to a data collection and some of the steps that you need to think about in between, including the granularity of rights assessments, file formats to create, the metadata to gather, how to structure a data set, where to store it, what kind of persistent identifier to give it, and then how to wrap all this up and make it available online as a data set. So we considered a number of different file structures. I think if anyone's interested, we went with A in the end. And we had to make a number of decisions about our standards, so where to store collections, what collections to make available as data, what metadata to include, and how to be transparent about all of these processes as well. In September 2019, we published the Data Foundry, and you can find this at data.nls.uk. Our open data platform has 3 main principles, so openness, we publish data openly and in reusable formats, transparency, this is around the provenance of our data and being open about how and why it's been produced, and then also practicality, so we want to make sure that our file formats and our data sets are as accessible as possible to different kinds of user groups. This has really been a whole library effort, including many teams right up to the National Librarian himself, Dr. John Scally, who many years ago envisaged a data foundry, as he called it, where people could melt down our collections and then weld them back together to create new outcomes. And while we've still got a way to go with this, it's been a real pleasure to start to fulfill that vision. So now that regular dataset release was up and running, we could begin engagement activity. You can see examples of this on our projects page, which has got some great work that people have carried out using the library's data. So as one example, we've worked with students who've used library data sets as part of their data visualization course, where they've been learning how to visualize data. And they've created really amazing videos and web outputs. They've mapped data. One group even produced a Minecraft world of 100 years of Encyclopedia Britannica, which you navigate on a little roller coaster. And there's the videos up online if you want to watch them. We've also had an artist in residence, Martin Disley, who was funded by Creative Informatics, and he used machine learning techniques with the collections and produced these eerie mangled metal bridges based on our Tay Bridge images. He's also produced maps of Scotland which never existed in the first place, based on our map collections as well. So it's worth having a look at his work. One of our data sets is being used in a new carpentry class, which is under development. So carpentries are openly licensed digital and data skills training courses, which are taught all around the world. I think they've been taught on every continent now. So it's really exciting to have our data being used in so many different locations for learning and teaching purposes. One unexpected success we had was through social media, where we tweet with the hashtag NLS data. Sean Graham from Carleton University in Canada saw the release of our chapbooks, and the first thing he thought of to do with them was to turn them into music. So he created a topic model from them and then a sonification, which is a data visualization, a musical data visualization, of our chapbooks printed in Scotland. We also now have an annual Digital Scholarship Fellowship, and this is currently occupied by Dr. Giles Burgle from the University of Oxford, who is exploring computer vision techniques and how they can help to identify chapbook illustrations. And this builds on the work of the Bodleian Ballads project a few years ago. Briefly, we've also got a series of internal engagement activities underway. This includes a staff training programme, which uses library carpentry classes to teach skills training from spreadsheets and OpenRefine through to Python and R. And then we also have a staff seminar series where we have invited speakers coming to talk about their digital scholarship related work or projects. And this has been great for setting our work in a wider context. And then, of course, earlier this year in March, lockdown happened. So how has this changed our digital scholarship service? The truth is it didn't change it much. So we've been really lucky that our service was already established for 6 months prior to lockdown. So much of the activity could continue as usual, with our monthly data releases continuing as scheduled and projects starting and ending as planned. However, we have seen a growth in activity in this area, and that's really part of an ongoing digital shift, I think, which RLUK has identified, which has just been accelerated by this movement to online working. So page views for our data founder increased when lockdown started, and we've seen increased use of data sets in classes and projects. But we did also realise the need to take collections out to this newly online-only audience. And this might be an audience that didn't perhaps know what to do with data sets. So we recruited an intern, a digital research intern, to create a series of Jupyter notebooks for our data sets, which carry out some initial exploratory analysis of the collections to show what's in them, what the potential could be for research questions, and to take our data sets to users who don't have coding skills. And that proved to be a really successful launch, and we've had quite considerable use of those Jupyter notebooks so far. There's lots of challenges working in digital scholarship and cultural heritage. I thought I'd talk about a couple of these now. And just to pick a couple of these, I won't go through them all now, but change is always a challenge. So people respond to change in different ways, and digital scholarship really involves change throughout the library, from workflows and processes to new ethics procedures that we need to think about, to a culture change more broadly that's going on in libraries at the moment. OCR also is always a challenge, especially with the mass digitisation programme, where OCR output really is the gold for digital scholarship needs. And then the scale and scope of digital scholarship is a big one. So there are a few areas of the library that digital scholarship doesn't touch. In many ways, I really think that digital scholarship is the library, and that's what makes it such a rewarding and interesting area to work in. But it also means that you often have to maintain a seemingly ruthless focus to be able to get anything done without spreading yourself too thin. So where does the future lie for us at the National Library of Scotland? Well, firstly, what have we learned so far? Well, it's worth putting time and effort into digital scholarship. And we've been really overwhelmed by the positive response to the Data Foundry into the Digital Scholarship Service. And it's really shown that there's an audience out there waiting for collections to be made available in these kinds of ways. We've also seen that there's more to digitisation than online image galleries, as I've mentioned. And we've been really lucky that the digital team could respond so quickly to that and change things here. Digital scholarship also has implications across the library, so there's barely a team that the service doesn't work with, and that's what makes this a really exciting role and area to work in. And then lastly, historic practices affect everything. So how something's been digitised, what metadata has been created or kept, what selection procedures have been agreed, all affect what can be done with materials later down the line. So there's quite a big responsibility on the people who are making these decisions. What's next for us? Well, we're exploring workflows for releasing different kinds of data, as well as what data acquisition processes might look like. We're looking to collaborate with academics to explore how machine learning could improve library processes and generate new research questions. And we're also looking at API access to some collections. And lastly, I think this activity has really shown us that digital scholarship is a disruptive influence in the library, and that that's not necessarily a bad thing. So in the same way that digital scholarship brings together academics from different research areas who haven't traditionally worked alongside one another, so it is in the library, and we're beginning to see that teams are coming together to work together in new ways. It may also be that teams that have been in the background more traditionally in library services may start to shift to the forefront, and skills will need to change to deliver collections in new ways. And all of this means revisiting the whole idea of what the library is in the first place. So digital scholarship encourages and requires us to look again at what libraries are and to think about whether they should still be this. So it gives us the tools to look at the diversity in our collections, and it enables us to think about what's missing and what gaps there are in records and collections and metadata, and to consider what this absence can tell us, and then crucially to act on this too. And it also encourages us to look again at library structures and roles within these structures. It also makes us think about the transparency between libraries and users, and the conditions within which data and digitised collections are being produced. So in the same way that we have book historians now, in the future there'll be data historians, and we need to anticipate their needs. So digital scholarship really has been a positive and disruptive influence. So that's a rundown of the first 2 years at the National Library of Scotland. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, please feel free to get in touch, and my contact details are on the screen. Thank you.
So thank you so much to Sarah for pre-recording that presentation for us. I'm going to move on now to our third and final speaker for this morning's session. That's Kirsty Lingstadt, who's the head of the Digital Library and Deputy Head of Library and University Collections at the University of Edinburgh. And Kirsty's going to talk to us about the work that's been undertaken around digital maturity modelling at the University of Edinburgh Library. And her presentation is entitled, Are We There Yet? Digital Maturity Modelling as Part of the Shift Left. So over to you, Kirsty.
Right, so are we there yet? Is a question that we asked ourselves 2 years ago. And through the work that we've undertaken through digital maturity modelling, and also I think through the pandemic over this last year, we've got a much clearer idea where we are on our digital transformation journey and where we're going. And I think talk of digital transformation, digital shift, shift left have become part of the current vocabulary, as the conference has demonstrated over the last couple of days. These concepts are everywhere, and particularly critical in libraries as well. And again, that's, I think, evidenced by the Digital Shift Manifesto, which RLUK launched last year in order to focus some of the issues that this work raises. So really critical part of our work. And there are many definitions around about digital transformation. I think the one that I quite often look to is this idea of digital transformation being the application of digital technologies to fundamentally impact on all aspects of business and society, and also on people. And I think, again, there's perhaps a better name for it than just transformation, which sometimes implies that there's going to be a finished state which will be reached. Digital will continue to change, as we've seen over the last few days. And so for me, it's very much around about that digital shift. And it's around about a change that's not just about operations, but it's also about culture. It's about mindset, and it's about our people who work within our institutions. So we need to really rethink the processes, the organization, those digital enablers, the data and technology, which we need as those enablers, but key to it all will be employee skills and the organizational culture to drive this change forward. And I think I really agree with something that Tom Scott at Wellcome said, that digital shift is fundamentally about people, culture, processes, and how we can use technology to place our users first and deliver services that are both useful, fun, but also empowering to all. So where are we just now? Well, libraries have been at the forefront of automation and exploring new technologies from very early on, which again has been shown in a number of talks. We moved quickly to library management systems with electronic discovery and reading or resource lists. And we've also significantly shifted from just having physical stock to having physical and digital stock, delivering our content online. And we even provide access to things that are no longer just textual, databases, software, and again, thinking around about collections as data, as Sarah was just touching on. And all these things have been particularly critical to us as libraries over the last year. But while we have moved forward, the world has also continued moving forward, and many areas have also embraced new ways of working that digital offered, whereas libraries have, I think, been stuck in that digitalization or digitization space rather than really embracing digital transformation. And I think this is because that's the easiest thing to do. It's the easiest thing that we can tackle and engage with, but also in order to truly transform, we need to be courageous and take a route that is perhaps less clear to all of us. So within the University of Edinburgh, we sit within a converged service. So library is part of the information services group, and this has a very strong digital agenda. And this is a slide that our CIO, Gavin McLaughlin, frequently uses. And I really like this particular description of what we're trying to do and achieve at the university. It's that idea that every educator works digitally, but that students are digitally able, that our services are also working in digital ways and workflows. And I think one of the reasons I also like this particular slide is actually, while technology is there and that digital word is there, it's actually about the people that do each of these particular activities. I think that's why it really strongly resonates with me. However, despite these clear statements and articulations within our university, and despite the mass activity that there is around about digital transformation is just not always on everyone's agenda. And again, a lot of our services within the library are focused on day-to-day delivery, on our customers and our users that are there right in front of us and working with them. And I think within the digital library, we've been aware that we needed to really shift left to transform and change to deliver to our users in a really different way. We had a really good, strong idea of where we wanted to go, and we'd started our journey a couple of years ago. But I think we began to think, well, where are we on this journey? How far have we come? And we therefore wanted to understand where we'd gotten to and where we still needed to get to, and so have a better insight on the work we needed to do to get there. And another factor which was turned out to be really, really helpful was the Information Services Group had set up a digital transformation team. It was just 2 members of staff, but still there it was within Information Services. And we began talking to them. They too wanted to explore where the university was, and they'd begun thinking around about how to understand the digital transformation journey that the university was on, which had a number of core programs within this space. So we decided to come together and start exploring this. And one of the things we were particularly attracted to was digital maturity modelling. So for digital maturity, this was the definition we decided to adopt, trying to look at how we'd adopted and were operating and how we were meeting user needs and expectations within this very digital world. So how did we decide to approach this? Well, we decided to pilot this. And again, we agreed that actually this was something, if we could do it and could do it well, that the university could utilize across its different services. So we're trying to pilot with the digital library and the library and understand how we could develop a model that could be undertaken by staff working in different areas and also could be applied to very, very different services. So we worked on this with the digital transformation team. And our objectives were to see whether this would be a good fit with the university's business model, whether we could be repeating this periodically in order to track progress. I think at one point I envisaged that this might be something that we redo in a few years' time to see where we've gotten to, whether it was applicable to the whole university and adaptable, and whether it could also be run internally by staff and be an effective model. So we looked at a range of different reference models with help of consultants, which were also brought in to provide some assistance. So we looked at some of these. You'll be familiar with many of these. Some of them may be newer to you, but we looked at both higher education and models out with. And in the end, the UCISA capability model was used, as that was something that could be easily cross-referenced again, looking at the capabilities that an organisation needs in order to be able to successfully achieve outcomes that deliver value to their customers. And the capability defines not just what the business does and can do, but how it's doing it and who's doing it. So it wasn't just looking at those business processes, functions and services, but was looking at these more widely. And during the design process, we looked at a subset of capabilities which we decided to pick. And we thought that this would be a useful lens and also map neatly to our organisational structures and also the areas that we were working within. So that's how we decided to approach it. And here are the capability areas which we decided to look at in more detail. And again, we very much looked at what was in and out of scope to make sure that we had a clear idea of what we were analysing and assessing. What I particularly liked was the fact that we looked at these different digital dimensions, and we thought very carefully around about the digital dimensions that we were going to assess. And as you can see from some of these headings, strategy and leadership, colleagues and culture, ways of working, but also digital services and experience, a lot of this wasn't actually around about the technology and the digital, but was around about the people and the culture and how we were working in order to undertake transformation and actually move forward. And I think these were really important to us as we were trying to explore how to take that thing forward. I think comes back to the point we've made a number of times. Digital isn't just about the technology. Yes, you have to understand the technology, but it's about the people. So we looked at a variety of different assessment techniques in order to assess what we had picked from the capability models. And again, there's a whole range of techniques for assessment that you can use. And we decided in the end what we were aiming for was a kind of 360 review of a service, and that we would use a number of different techniques in order to achieve this. So we looked at one-to-one meetings, but also group discussions. There was journey and service mapping, and there was the inevitable questionnaire that we took. I think the only thing we didn't do so much was observations of users actually using our services, but we did actually put together a couple of focus groups with key users in order to get their take on what we were providing. And while this sounds quite heavy, yes, it was heavy to deliver and work through as a sort of pilot, but actually the time it took was far less than you think, and I'll be able to pick up on that later. One final piece that we had to also put in place was just what were our levels of maturity so that we could assess where we were and where we were going. And I think while we quite liked the idea of looking at digital immaturity and maturity, but we decided that actually having a level that was equivalent to a tantruming 2-year-old and a stroppy teenager was perhaps not particularly helpful when we were encouraging services to move through the different levels, although we did really like the idea of mature seniors. So we abandoned that idea of levels and actually moved towards something that you'll all recognise. And I think this is why we decided to use them, but also because they're relatively intuitive, informative and well known. So it's Tuckman's level of maturity. And again, they had no unwanted implications or kind of associations to the words that we were using. So we looked at them in terms of forming, storming, norming, performing, and then finally transforming. And in order to just give us a little bit more granularity around about these 5 areas, we split them into upper and lower. So now that you've got an idea of what we were thinking about, how we thought through the pilot, now comes the interesting bit. Where were we and what level of maturity had we reached in actual fact within the library? Well, looking at it from our perspective, we found that the library team overall was on the storming point of the scale, and the consultant felt that we would be able to move through to norming if we continued working on where we were, and also followed some of the recommendations that came out of the assessment that he carried out. And again, we had a sort of number of graphs and diagrams, and here you can see we were looking at not just the leadership team, but all our colleagues and where we were. So you get this very nice graph showing where we'd reached and where we were within these levels, and also where we were moving to. And again, we thought a little bit around about the perceptions and where people actually were within their journey. And there was some variety that emerged at this particular point. Interestingly enough, the leadership within the library was at a slightly higher level of maturity in a couple of areas in comparison to the wider colleagues. And I think while people might go, oh, that's a bit surprising, perhaps not. It's something that we were really engaging with. We were talking a lot about digital shift. I maybe blame myself. I was talking about digital transformation and the digital library program that we were undertaking a lot. So there was a lot of discussion around about those digital areas and elements, which perhaps weren't always percolating through to other areas quite so strongly. And that's something that we do still need to work on, that communication piece across all areas, especially when people are engaged in day-to-day activity and have less engagement with some of these programs and projects. So we broke it down and we had, as I say, those different digital dimensions. So here I'll just quickly run through where we were within each one, the recommendations that were made at the time. And in green, I've actually highlighted some of the things that have quite significantly changed over the last year with the pandemic hitting. So on strategy and leadership, we scored actually fairly highly. We had some strong working practices in place, and obviously we had things that I mentioned like the digital transformation program in train. We were doing a range of digital projects. What did really emerge, and something we already knew but was confirmed through the work that was done, that we didn't really have a very strong, coherent and proactive social media strategy and engagement across all our sort of social media platforms. And I think this is something we've been aware of. It was kind of confirmed through this work, and it's something we've had to really tackle and work through quite quickly over the last year, as this type of communication really took on a different level of importance. Colleagues and culture was an area I was very interested in. And I think this is interestingly where the senior management team scored slightly lower than the rest of the teams within the library. And this was very much around about attitude to risk and our risk appetite. And I think reflected the sort of difference that we had within our management team. Perhaps also reflects what a lot of people will recognise when you're working in a larger organisation and you're within the professional services element. It's sometimes quite hard to be risky and take risks because you're delivering services that people depend on, and therefore having them fail or not work the way you anticipate isn't often a luxury you can take. Very hard to build in, and I think this is one of the really key challenges for us within libraries when we're looking at what we're doing. How do we build that risk, that innovation piece in order to be able to try out new things and recognize that they genuinely might not work, and have users who are willing to come with us on that journey? So again, a really interesting piece. But again, we've worked through and been investing in a number of different activities. Ways of working. And again, this is something that we've continued to build on. And again, I think something that this year in particular has contributed to and helped move forward quickly. This looked at kind of digital organisation, our delivery frameworks, how our colleagues were involved, and what digital methods we used when we were providing services for our users. And again, there were some practical steps. And again, we've looked much more at metrics and data in order to understand what our users are wanting, how they're working, and how we can then help support them. One thing that's still to be implemented is a much more explicit and kind of almost co-curation approach to developing new services from scratch. And I think the pandemic has seen us start doing some of these activities, but these processes take time to embed, and we'll need to do a lot more work in the future in this area. Digital innovation. While we were innovative in our thinking and aiming to do a range of things, this has taken time to embed. And again, it had quite a low school, but we've really moved forward on this over the last year. And I think, again, our staff have changed how they approach this innovation piece and how they approach service delivery and how they think around about things. So I think that's been something we've really positively benefited over the course of the last year. We were already doing some good work around about implementation and governance, but again, we needed to do more. And again, more around about trying out some new technologies. But again, we've benefited from having a university that's really engaged with digital transformation, for being able to undertake the digital library program and having structures that support us to try out new things and do new things. And again, around about this digital service experience, we've linked to the wider university strategies, but actually that picture too has changed within the immediate term. And again, we didn't really think we'd be implementing and looking at services that really prioritised chat when we came to the end of this pilot. Funnily enough, that has become a key area of focus over the last year as we've all been working remotely. So chat and remote consultation has absolutely become the way that we work, and we've really accelerated how we've operated in this space. So that's what we were looking to achieve and measure. We were looking to see where we were now, and that was what our picture of tomorrow looked like when we were discussing this with the digital transformation team. And while we've moved some way forward, I would say that we still have more to do. We still need to have users who can co-create services with us. We still need to work on some of those process and information ecosystems. And I think some of the challenges Sarah touched on around about how we present our collections online and make them really available in this hybrid world that we've now moved to requires quite a lot of steps and thinking and a real change in our working practices that we're still very much engaged in. So these were the next steps and the reflections at the end of the pilot. We did actually have some interesting challenges around about language, and I suspect actually that piece has disappeared almost completely. We did use very technical language during the pilot. A lot of staff did feedback that they really struggled with that. We've changed that pilot. And I have to say this particular methodology has now been adapted, refined, and has since been run with the Institute for Academic Development, and a number of other services within the university are now going to use that and engage with it to see where they are in this transformation journey, as everyone has begun to understand how useful a tool it can be to see where you are and where you need to go. And I think within the digital library and within the library more widely, it enabled us to have some conversations with staff that we perhaps wouldn't normally have these conversations with, and also got them thinking around about some of these areas, which I think in retrospect has been really valuable for this year that we've been through. So where now? Well, I think when I look at what our next steps are now, I would say that digital first has absolutely become the way that we think. And a lot of that, I have to say, has been to do with the pandemic and how that's influenced thinking. We've seen hybrid become part of how the university operates, and that's both on the professional services side as well as across all other areas. And again, that sort of culture shift. Our people have changed how they think, our staff have changed, our users have changed, and I think that's been a really key thing. We've become more agile in our delivery. We've allowed ourselves to take a few more risks while still thinking around about services and what user expectations are. And I think interestingly enough, within the University of Edinburgh, we now have a digital strategy that's being developed for the whole of the university. And we've moved from thinking not just about the physical estate, but actually to giving the digital estate equal importance with the physical. So there's been some really significant shifts. And I do think we need to keep moving forward, because as both Karis and Masood so aptly highlighted earlier on in the week, digital shift keeps moving on. Those industrial revolutions keep moving, but it's not just about that. It's also about our people, as Rosie Jels highlighted, and also Sarah. People and our users and our staff want things to move forward. We have users that are digitally confident, that know how to use a wide range of services and systems, and actually have the capacity to code and almost get anything they need. to users who lack confidence or who can use Google, but God forbid that they should actually be able to engage with our library systems, because actually the way they think and want to interact with our content has significantly changed. So I think faced with that, we do have to ask ourselves, what next? And here's what Gartner sees as some of the sort of top technology trends for 2021. So life is going to keep on moving onwards. We need to keep on shifting. We need to rethink, we need to engage with AI, and we need to think around about what will our role be in libraries. We have the ability, as Ed showed us earlier, to actually use AI. We also have collections that can help contribute to retraining AI to remove some of that bias out of it. But all of this will need leadership within our organizations, and we'll need our people to help us get there at all levels. And I think Kara's touched on this as well. This digital shift is something we all have to engage with in order to move forward, because what we're actually doing is we're at a critical point where we're reimagining what our libraries, what our services will be like to serve users. And I think we have to be as imaginative as we found people in the 50s and 60s being. I love Arthur Radebell's illustrations of closer than we think. This is how he thought the library might look in those future years. We've seen other illustrations. I love this illustration from one of our students who envisaged a library on the cloud, where they could engage with any kind of content in an environment that they chose easily wherever they wanted to. So we really are at that point where we're transforming the library to deliver for our people, and we need to do that and keep on engaging with it in order to be part of a future industrial revolution. So thank you very much.
I think that's a real call to arms for us all. Very challenging and exciting vision of the future. I'm going to move us on now to question session. We've got a number of questions coming in already. I'm going to start with a question for Nori, which is around metrics. And how do we decide which metrics are good, reliable, reasonable, etc., and which ones aren't?
Yes, it's a loaded question, isn't it? Would you be able to, sorry, can I respond to David and Donald's questions, that kind of sort of, so that yes. I can respond? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, yeah. If you want to take all of those, Nori, please go ahead and take all 3 questions. Yeah. I
also do not wish to actually take up so much of everyone's time as well. So I might just actually package my responses in that way, if it's okay. Mm-hmm. So first of all, to start with, in response to David's question, first of all, thank you for the question. DORA certainly kicked in Australia, and I think one really good example is the ERA, which is the national level assessment of the research conducted by the research organization, including universities, that happened in 2018. The format was very different, and it focused on the impact and engagement. So the ARC, which is the Australian Research Council, which is the national administrating body, they asked the researchers and institutions to submit the kind of impact narrative, which really is to distance away from the metrics and try to come up with a more of a qualitative stories to illustrate the impacts and engagement of the research being conducted, under the funding. So it's certainly kicked in. And the funding body, for example, National Health and Medical Research Council, they also actually sort of made a statement, around discouraging the peer reviewers of the assessment of the research not to sort of rely heavily on the journal impact factors and other metrics. So there is certainly actually the cultural climates in the research communities not to rely on the metrics. And in a way, the way we often sort of feel is that universities are really trying to remove the kind of cult of the metrics, which was actually grown, in a previous sort of, decade, but at the same time, when we are trying to remove this cult of metrics. Of course, this coincides with the emergence of the, so many types of metrics. So many early career researchers and PhD students actually who sort of come into this community actually, recently, they actually have a very mixed message. On one hand, there is a legacy of this cult of metrics. So they feel like actually they have to do something about it. But on the other hand, actually, their research communities as well as the regulators are really pushing people to produce something, with a very strong impact. And I think, we are kind of in an interesting landscape where there are mixed messages. And there's also discouragement of the sort of, the numbers. So there was a time when there was a very strong emphasis on the number of publications. But at the moment, both at the university level, as well as at the different levels, there is a very strong emphasis on, more quality publication rather than shallow and wide sort of publication strategy. The reason I sort of responded to David's question is that it really leads to, what Donald's asking, which is about, altmetrics, which is a sort of non-traditional, publication format. And as the regulators and also the research communities are really looking at the impact, engagement, quality research, this is where there is a very strong push, to think about not just about the systematic approach to the traditional publication strategies, but also how you actually curate your researcher profile and researcher identities using the other means, as in altmetrics. So I'm not talking about altmetric.com. Just more as a broad category of altmetric as a kind of category. And I think actually there is a very strong focus on it. And I think in light of this, and I think actually this probably responds in part to Donald's question as well as Koko's question, is that it's not so much about, the way we actually nowadays sort of, do things in a research training field is that we don't necessarily say this metrics is bad and this metrics is good. It's more about actually thinking about which metrics you can actually use to construct your researcher identity. So, I'm, quite lucky to be part of some of the research training units and so on. And, one of the things actually we really focus on, especially as part of the induction of PhD students and so on, is really about have a think about how you can curate your researcher identity using the metrics. So for example, if they, have 5 social media accounts, it's very likely that it's going to be very sparse and not very quality, online presence. Then how do you actually focus on one particular channel, which will actually eventually feeds back to, better metrics in the altmetric field. And very much the same message comes from very experienced professors and research professors, sort of saying, don't try to aim for the really high metrics, to start with. Just think about what kind of stepping stone publication you can make. And so that actually you can, build your metrics rather than obtain the metrics straight away. And that sort of spirit, is really prominent at the moment. So, just to summarize, I think, it's the way we, as in the library sort of supports this field is actually really about, just trying to make sense of this landscape, and also helping the researchers, how they can make sense of this landscape and build their researcher profile, more mid and long term. And we certainly actually work with the research office as well as the teaching staff to actually sort of, send that message. So hopefully actually, that kind of, at least in part responds to the questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Nori. Question for Kirsty now. Kirsty, a bit of feedback, really interesting piece of work, very informative in helping libraries to move forwards. Can you give us an indication of how much time and effort went into this?
Sure. I mean, I think it took a little bit longer to do because this was a pilot and we were trying to establish a methodology for the university to roll out across the institution. So what we found is it took about 8 weeks of elapsed time, and I think we spent probably about 18 days worth of staff time on it across a kind of range of different activities. I think when that is broken down, and when we look at the kind of model being run again, it's about, you need 2 to 3 core members of staff, and it's about a sort of 5 to 6 day project for them. And then you're involving a range of other staff in kind of different discussion sessions where you might have different teams involved in a 1 to 2 hour session talking through or discussing something. And there's also a kind of staff, yes, there's the inevitable staff survey and questionnaire, which we found took around about sort of 20-25 minutes to sort of complete and then sort of bring back and collate. But again, we've now sort of set that up. We've simplified the language. We've run it a couple of times by the digital transformation team. And again, it's useful having someone who is involved in the methodology and has that sort of background and can help rerun it and do the assessment side of things. But I think we found it useful, and it helped sort of widen that digital conversation that we were already having. But I think what's also really useful about it, it brings the focus back on the people. It's the people, the skills and the capabilities that's really core to this digital shift that we're all trying to do. And I think it nicely sort of helped us understand where we were in some areas and where we needed to kind of move forward in others. So it's, yeah, you know, it's roughly a 20-day project, if you want to put it in project terminology, as our project team like to do. It's not a small piece of work, but it's also not a huge piece of work when you think round about it. I hope that answers.
That's great, thank you, Kirsty. And I've got a question for Stuart, which is about interdisciplinary research, really, and to what extent do you see, you know, the digital scholarship developments that you've been putting in place driving interdisciplinary research, and what new collaborations have you seen emerging across disciplines?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think a really big one. A lot of this, I think when we first started publishing data sets, a lot of it we found, you know, was almost like a single user with a single question wanting to use them that way. But I think we are starting now to see a lot more of the interdisciplinary sort of side of this, you know, particularly in terms of sort of mixing those with the technology skills, you know, maybe in computer science, informatics, that side of things, with those with sort of, you know, for example, in the humanities and the social sciences. I mean, one good example of that, so something actually Sarah didn't mention in the slides, is we launched a fellowship scheme, so the National Librarians Fellowship in Digital Scholarship a couple of years ago. And so we're just entering the second year of that now. And so it was interesting sort of seeing the applicants that were applying for that. And for the first time, actually, we got a pair of researchers working together, putting application in, and that was sort of around music and the ballads that we have online. So sort of seeing, could you sort of tie the music collections we have up with the ballads to try and sort of say, well, actually, this ballad could be sung to this tune, that sort of thing. And so we're actually sort of starting to see that more. In a sense, I suppose we see ourselves then as sort of the third leg to the stool, really, in terms of sort of providing the data and the curators really now in terms of sort of helping link that together. So getting our curators sort of almost working interdisciplinary that way as well, thinking about how our collections can relate together. So that's sort of been a really interesting side effect for us, sort of in that same theme.